Thanks, Dave. I am going to talk about U.S. alliances in Asia, but in particular, I'm going to talk about it this afternoon in the context of the so-called pivot to Asia. Now, how many people know what the pivot to Asia is? People know what the pivot to Asia is? Right? The pivot to Asia is the Obama administration's decision, really a few years ago, that there would be a strategic pivot in U.S. grand strategy and U.S. foreign policy to Asia, in the sense that for the future, at least 2 generations, U.S. interests would be defined by its economic and security presence in Asia. Part of it was pivoting out of 2 wars in the Middle East and in Central Asia to this concept of Asia as being sort of key to U.S. future. Right? This has really been probably the hallmark of the administration's first term in office, and it continues to be a very important part of the way the administration defines foreign policy, how it's going to be remembered in terms of its foreign policy, in spite of the fact that there are many other issues on the agenda now, as we all know. You know, Ebola in West Africa, ISIS, Syria, Ukraine, there are many other issues. But the pivot to Asia is a very big part of that. And if there's one message I want to leave with you today, it's that every administration comes into office having a plan, right? They have an idea, they have a plan, they thought about it during the campaign, and they've been really focused on implementing that plan. But sometimes things don't turn out the way you want them to, right? And in the case of the Obama administration's pivot to Asia, the common assumption is that this is something that the folks in the White House have thought about year after year till they introduced it to the public. And I think while we'd like to believe that's the case, it's not always that simple, right? In fact, the folklore is that when an outgoing president leaves the White House, the last thing that he or she does is that they leave a note for the incoming president. Now, I worked at the White House. I didn't personally witness this, but that's sort of the folklore. And the folklore is that the note that was left for President Obama when he came into office was a short, simple note that said, administrations are remembered not for their plan coming in, but how they dealt with the surprises, right? That's what they're remembered for, right? And so I would argue today that I think the Obama administration had a plan for Asia, and had a plan for alliances in Asia, but the plan that they had come in with was not the plan that they implemented. In other words, the Asia that they expected was not the Asia that they got. Right? Now, I don't mean this in a negative way. Running policy is all about adjusting. That's all it is. It's about adjusting. So I'm simply making the observation that I think in many ways the Asia that the administration had hoped that they would encounter was not exactly the Asia that they got. Okay? And so what I'd like to do is take you through different aspects of U.S. strategy and show you how what the plan was coming in was not what the plan was going out. Okay? So, what's the basis upon which I do this? So, there are during the campaign of the Obama administration, there were lots of discussions that took place in Washington. Contrary to what people think on Asia policy, the people who work Asia policy in Washington are not very partisan. We're actually quite nonpartisan. We all know each other. We all hang out together. It's a very not cool crowd, but we hang out together. We talk Asia policy, and that's what we like to do, right? And so when I left the White House in 2007, I was part of these conversations, on both sides of the aisle. right, with both the Republicans and the Democrats. And then talking to the folks on the Democratic side, you kind of get a sense of what they were thinking about when they were thinking about Asia. The first thing they were thinking is, we don't have a lot of bandwidth, right? In other words, for the people who are going to manage Asia policy for the next administration, they knew they didn't have a lot of bandwidth in the sense that they were not going to get a lot of high-level attention from, for the president, from the national security advisor. Why? Because we were in the midst of a financial crisis, a financial meltdown, right, and 2 wars. So if anything, they were not going to get a lot of time, and the issue was, what were the main messages, what were the main issues when they had the attention of their principals that they wanted them to focus on? What were the main objectives? Okay, and I would say that for Asia, there were probably 4, right, 4 objectives. The first objective was with regard to China, right? And here, I think essentially the notion that the administration thought of was what you might call responsible stakeholder plus, okay? Now, in order to understand what responsible stakeholder plus is, you first have to know what responsible stakeholder is. Now, does anybody know what responsible stakeholder is? Okay, well, I'll tell you what responsible stakeholder is. It's a notion that was conceived of during the previous administration, during the Bush administration, by Robert Zoellick, who was then the Deputy Secretary of State. And the idea was simply that as China rises in the international system, right, as China rises in the international system, it needs to become more of a responsible stakeholder in terms of providing for the public goods of the international system. Right? More of a responsible stakeholder in terms of providing for the public goods of the international system. So what does that mean? That means being responsible on non-proliferation, right? Being responsible on climate change, right? Being responsible in terms of overseas development assistance to Africa, right? Being responsible in terms of human rights, right? All these sorts of things. That was the basic idea. Initially, when it was presented to the Chinese, their reaction was quite positive, because I don't know if something got lost in the translation, but they thought the United States was saying, you are a responsible stakeholder. And they had to be corrected, right? The argument was not that they were now a responsible stakeholder, but in the future, if this was going to work, they had to be more of a responsible stakeholder, okay? Responsible stakeholder plus, right, for the Obama administration was essentially the idea that we had now reached the point where China needed to play a role, right? This was no longer an aspirational thing, right? They had to play a role. How do we know this? President Obama, his first trip to Asia is in November of 2009. It's for APEC in Singapore. But on the way to APEC in Singapore, he stops in Japan and gives a big speech in Suntory Hall in Japan in which he says 3 things, right? The first thing he says is that the United States does not seek to contain China, right? A very clear statement by the President of the United States that the United States does not seek to contain China. Right? The second thing he says is that China is central to the US global agenda. Not that China is central to the global agenda or to the US agenda, but China is central to the US global agenda. Right? This then led journalists and everybody to say, oh, this is something new. Right? This is some sort of partnership. And the journalists started coming up with the term G2, right? Group of 2. Right? The United States and China attached at the hip, trying to solve the world's problems. Right? The Obama administration didn't like that term. The Hu Jintao government didn't like that term, but it stuck, right? The G2 concept, responsible stakeholder plus the G2 concept, right? And the hope was that the U.S. would foster a conciliatory and cooperative relationship with China in which they would focus on solving some of the world's global problems. And just, by coincidence, at the same time, the United States wasn't authorizing any arms sales for Taiwan. Right? And the president wasn't meeting with the Dalai Lama. right? Something that every previous president had done. Right? So there was clearly a plan here to try to build this deep cooperative relationship with China. Okay? Now, the cornerstone of US policy in Asia since 1945, going back to the writings of people like George Kennan, right, and John Foster Dulles, the cornerstone of US policy in Asia is Japan. Right? It's always been Japan. And so for the Obama administration, the idea was we can't do this new concept for China, right? We can't do this new concept for China unless it is embedded in a deep alliance, continued deep alliance with Japan, right? Very deep strategic alliance with Japan. So in Japan, the idea was Japan's always been the US policy sort of starts in Asia with Japan, it ends in Asia with Japan. Japan is still the key ally, and we need that deep relationship if we're going to push forward with this new idea with regard to China. Right? How do we know this? Secretary Clinton, when she becomes Secretary of State, right, her first overseas trip as Secretary of State is to Japan. Right? The first foreign head of state to visit the Obama White House is the Japanese Prime Minister, right? Taro Aso, then Taro Aso, the Japanese Prime Minister. So very clearly this was the idea, right? Steady as she goes on Japan, this is the key relationship. We can't do what we want to do with China unless we're solidly tied up with Japan. Okay. What about the Korean Peninsula? Okay. On the Korean Peninsula, there really wasn't much thought given to South Korea, I'm sorry to say, with apologies to those in the audience. It really was about China and Japan, but North Korea figured in their thinking for certain, right? And basically the idea on North Korea was what you might call six-party talks plus, right? Six-party talks plus. So when I was in government, we negotiated these two agreements with North Korea, something called the September 2005 Joint Statement and the February 2007 implementation of the Joint Statement. And then we didn't really get very far after that, right? And then it got turned over to the next administration. And they sort of did, as they should, they did a lot of research. They looked at the negotiating record. They called a bunch of us former negotiators in to talk about what had happened and everything. And they had to make a decision about what they were going to do. Right? And so they made their decision. Basically, they were going to continue with the six-party talks. They were going to continue with the six-party agreements. But in addition to continuing with those agreements, they were going to engage in high-level bilateral negotiations with North Korea. Right, high-level bilateral negotiations with North Korea. Now, why was that such a difference in policy? Largely because the previous administration, the one I was in, we were more averse to doing high-level bilateral negotiations with North Korea. Right? President Bush really didn't like the North Korean leader. I think at one point he even called him a pygmy. Did not like the human rights situation. So for a variety of reasons, we preferred to do the negotiation in this multilateral format. There were other reasons, but we decided to do the negotiations in a multilateral format that reached these two agreements. The North Koreans would much prefer to deal bilaterally with the United States, right? Because they want to operate face-to-face, head-to-head with the United States. So the Obama administration's idea was, look, we'll do the six-party talks, we have these agreements, but we think we could have gone much farther. We can go much farther if we also supplemented the six-party talks with our own high-level bilateral dialogue with North Korea, right? How do we know this? Every new administration comes in and they have their choice of creating special envoy positions. Usually it's about 16 or 17 special envoy positions coming out of the State Department. And so the Obama administration was no different. They had 16 or 17 special envoys. 4 out of the 16 or 17 special envoys were for North Korea, right? 4 out of the 16 or 17. North Korea is a very small country, right? There was only 1 envoy for Afghanistan, Pakistan, right? There was only 1 envoy for the Middle East peace process. There was only 1 envoy for Ireland, right? There were 4 for North Korea, right? A special envoy for North Korea, a special envoy for 6-party talks, a special envoy for human rights, and a special envoy for implementing sanctions, UN sanctions against North Korea. So 4, right? In addition to that, at the very beginning of the administration, one of these special envoys, the senior envoy for North Korea, went to North Korea. And he went to North Korea with communications, right, from the highest levels in the United States about how to move forward in terms of the relationship. Ready to deliver those communications, again, to signal that they're willing to go forward with these high-level bilateral talks, something that they perceive the previous administration as being unwilling to do. Okay? And I said there were 4. And then the 4th issue, very quickly, is trade. Right? And essentially the story there was the Obama administration inherited several free trade agreements from the previous administration that had not yet been ratified. They had been negotiated and completed, but not yet ratified by our Congress. The most important or prominent of which was something called CORUS, the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. Right? CORUS, the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, at the time was the largest bilateral free trade agreement ever negotiated by the United States, let alone, not to mention Korea, of course. It was also the biggest free trade agreement since NAFTA. Right? So a major free trade agreement. There were several others that were from Latin America, but this was sort of the biggest free trade agreement that had been not yet ratified. And the Obama administration came in, and essentially they called a timeout on the free trade agreements. Right? They said, we want to relook at these agreements. We want to look at, in particular, the labor and the environment clauses in these agreements. We want to sort of take a timeout and reevaluate all this stuff. Right? How do we know this? There were only 2 trade actions taken by the Obama administration in their first year in office, and both of them are punitive tariffs, right? Protective tariffs. One on Chinese steel pipes, and one on Chinese tires, right? That's the only sort of action that they take. Okay? So again, every administration comes in with a plan, right? Now what I just described to you is not a plan that's written down anywhere, right? But it's just what I gathered from listening to, talking to people who are working policy. This is sort of what their idea was going in, I would argue. Okay? So what happens? So on every one of these issues, the 4 that I mentioned, big surprises. Okay? Let's start at the top. Let's start with China. Right? In the case of China, again, the idea was G2, responsible stakeholder plus, and the big payoff, right, from doing all this, no arms sale to Taiwan, tight, close bilateral negotiation discussions, trying to build, some rapport with the Chinese leadership. No meeting with the Dalai Lama in the first year, all this stuff. The payoff for all this was supposed to come at Copenhagen, right? The big climate change summit in Copenhagen. This was where the whole idea of G2, right? China being an integral part of a new climate change regime, right? You can't have a new climate change regime without key emitters like China, India, Brazil in it, right? This was sort of this was supposed to be the big payoff. Right? And so what happens? You get an agreement at Copenhagen, but it's not the best agreement. Right? It's not the most exciting agreement. And if you talk to people who were doing this, there was a lot of disappointment with regard to China. Right? That it did not sort of make the big commitment and take on a leadership role that the administration had hoped for. In addition, President Obama makes his first trip to Asia in November of 2009. He goes to Japan, he goes to Singapore, then he goes to China, right? Then he goes to Beijing. Right? And in Beijing, he encounters a Chinese public and a Chinese government that, to put it sort of bluntly, that had a lot of self-confidence, right? Were in fact maybe even a little bit obnoxious, right? Because they just come off the Olympics, right? The Beijing Olympics. The United States, we were in financial crisis, right? They saw a young new president, right? So they were they had a lot of hubris, right? And so that visit to China at a personal level didn't really go as well as people had hoped, right? It just didn't, right? And there were things that happened during the trip, President Obama wanted to do sort of a live speech, take questions through the Chinese version of Twitter, and the Chinese authorities were trying to stop all of that. So overall, it didn't go very well, right? So China policy didn't turn out as they had hoped. Japan. The idea was sort of a deep, strong relationship with Japan. What happens in Japan? Domestic politics. Right? For the first time in 60 years, the right of center conservative liberal democratic party, LDP, gets voted out of office. Right? And the progressives come into office for the first time in 60 years, really. Right? And they decide, if you're an opposition party and you've been in the opposition for 6 decades, you're very good at criticizing things and very good at sort of saying what you don't like. But when you're in office, you have to say what you're for, right? And so they had a hard time defining that. But one of the ways they did define it was they said, we're not going to have the same policy with regard to the alliance in the United States like the LDP had for 6 decades. Right? So what did that mean? That was, that would be sort of like the equivalent of Nomuhyun in Japan, right? For those of you who know Korean politics. The idea that you had a leftist center leader that in part was trying to define the identity of this new party in opposition to this very close, almost incestuous relationship that existed for 6 decades between the United States and the Japanese government. So these guys were doing things like pulling out of Afghanistan, right? They were helping provide some logistics support in Afghanistan. Japan, under this new leadership, Hashimoto said, we're not doing that. They stopped the big base realignment agreements that the United States and Japan had negotiated under the previous administration. They did a number of things to show that they were going to do things differently. Right? So that was very surprising. Then on top of that, what happens in 2011? You have the tsunami, you have the earthquake, the tsunami, and then the nuclear meltdown in Fukushima. Right? And so just like that, Japan, which had been the cornerstone of US policy in Asia, all of a sudden now is out of the picture. Right? They are focused internally, trying to deal with their own domestic politics, but also trying to recover from the so-called triple disaster. Okay? North Korea. Again, the plan was to go do these high-level negotiations. The senior envoy goes to North Korea. He's got a letter saying that he's ready to have these, to move forward on the 6-party process, to create an opportunity for even bigger advances in U.S.-North Korea relations. And what's the response from North Korea? Well, it isn't thank you, right? The response from North Korea is a ballistic missile test, right? In April of 2009. Then it's a nuclear test in May of 2009 on Memorial Day of 2009. And if you think that it just coincidentally was on Memorial Day, you're wrong. I mean, they picked these dates for a reason. When I was in government, they did their largest series of ballistic missile tests on July 4th, sort of their own version of fireworks, and celebrating American independence, as well as celebrating President Bush's birthday, because it was right around the same time. Then in 2010, they sink a South Korean naval vessel, right, the Cheonan, and then they fire artillery on a South Korean island, right? So again, the Asia that they expected was not the Asia that they got, right? Then there's trade. What about trade issues? On trade, you know, they made very clear what they wanted to do. They wanted to reopen the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, renegotiate particularly the labor and environment clauses in those agreements. And then the administration goes to APEC in Singapore. Right? APEC countries make up, I think, 46, if not more, % of global trade. Right? The APEC agenda is all about reducing barriers to trade. At these big multilateral meetings like APEC, EAS, you know, there's the big meetings where everybody, you see pictures of them all sitting there together, all the world leaders. But there's also what in the trade is known as side bilateral meetings, right? Essentially, you have the big meetings, but because all the world leaders are there, they want to transact business on the side in side bilateral meetings. An opportunity to meet with another leader bilaterally, you know, in a hotel room, at the convention site or something, because they have issues they want to discuss bilaterally. So you can imagine, this is Obama's first trip to Asia, right? This is the guy who grew up in Hawaii, has lived in Indonesia for part of his life, was the first truly, right, American president that had some sort of Asian heritage or Asianness about him. It's his first trip to Asia. So every leader wants to meet him, right? Every leader wants a meeting with him. And they can't accommodate everybody, so they say, since this APEC is in Singapore, it's ASEAN, you know, ASEAN is hosting, ASEAN leaders, they can all meet with him, right? They all get a meeting with him. And so I wasn't there, I was out of government, but what I was told was, you know, they set up these meetings, and each guy, you know, each leader waits for the President Obama, and President Obama walks in the room. And, you know, these leaders, they're all leaders of their country, and they're all sort of very distinguished and everything. President Obama walks in the room, and their knees start to shake, right? They're so excited, right? Because it's him, right? The chosen one, the rock star, right? And so they're so nervous, and they're so excited, and they go, "Oh, we're so happy to meet you. You're everything we love about the United States, right? This is why we have so much faith in your country, and we like you so much more than the last guy," right? But at the same time, we have one question for you, and it's kind of an important question. And so it's like, sure, what's the question? And the question is consistent among all leaders. They want to know what U.S. trade policy is. Because this is November of 2009, right? It's been 9 months of this new administration, and there's no trade policy. And you know, these small countries are all concerned that if the United States doesn't have a trade policy, then China, right, is going to start creeping into everything, right? So they're very concerned. I mean, they're not as concerned on the security side because of the alliance system, but they're very concerned on the trade side, right? And so, you know, when you get out of the White House bubble and you go to a meeting like this, these sorts of things really make an impression because you're hearing directly from the other world leader what's on their minds, right? And so that was the fourth thing, right? The fourth thing that they expected but they didn't get. Now, I'm not trying to be critical of the Obama administration, right? I'm not trying to be critical at all. I'm merely pointing out that the Asia that they expected was not the Asia that they got, and every administration's mettle is truly tested not by what they wanted to do coming in, but how they reacted to the unexpected events, right? And so in this regard, I think the way the administration reacted was good, right? Very positive. And if we look at trade, for example, what's the key issue that the United States is now focused on in Asia. It's something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? The largest free trade agreement, multilateral free trade agreement negotiation in Asia today, right? It involves the second, and it's 12 or 13 member states, but most importantly involves the second and the third largest economies in the world, right? The United States and Japan. And if an agreement can be reached on something like this, this would be an extremely important institution in Asia. It would probably be the most important legacy of the Obama administration of the United States in Asia, would be leading the creation of this new free trade institution. On Japan, the United States and Japan took the triple disaster of Fukushima and turned it into a positive for the relationship, right? Operation Tomodachi was a public and private sector effort to help with the recovery as well as rejuvenate the U.S.-Japan alliance. You had domestic political change in Japan where the conservatives came back into office under Prime Minister Abe. The United States is very supportive now of Abe's security policies and his economic policies. And so that relationship has sort of come back to where it was. Right? On North Korea, the administration went from probably being the most forward-leaning administration in terms of policy with regard to North Korea to becoming the overseer of probably the most robust UN Security Council bank sanctions regime in the history of the issue, right? So very tough now on North Korea. They sound like the previous administration on North Korea. And then on South Korea, right, also not really on the radar screen when they came in, but became very important, right? South Korea became very important because what happened was that as the United States was looking for friends and partners around the world, when it was doing things like pulling out of Iraq and surging in Afghanistan, or trying to create a global agenda on the security of nuclear materials, right, or trying to move forward with a new climate change regime, they were finding that many countries in Europe and in Asia that said, we're with you, when push came to shove, they really weren't, right? Like, so on Afghanistan, he pulled out of Iraq, he surged in Afghanistan, then looked to NATO countries for help, and, they were all like, oh, what time is it? I'm sorry, Mr. President, I got to catch a plane, right? They were not there. But the South Koreans were there, right? At that time, Lee Myung-bak was the president, and he said, I'll send a PRT to Afghanistan, right? On trying to create a global regime for the security of nuclear materials. The South Koreans said, we'll host the summit. We'll host the Global Nuclear Security Summit, right? On trying to create the concept of a G20, a group of 20, no longer the G8, group of 8, but a group of 20 nations that were responsible for governing of the world economy, governing of the global commons, these sorts of things. That was another concept that came out of the financial crisis. And the South Koreans were like, we'll host a summit, right? So, so like Phoenix out of the ashes, right? The South Koreans sort of emerged, as Japan sort of fell by the wayside. The G2 thing with China wasn't working. North Korea was off being North Korea, right? And the trade agenda was sort of going nuts. The South Koreans were kind of emerging, right? They were really emerging. And then on China, essentially, we went from a period where there was probably a little bit too much optimism in U.S.-China relations to today, where things are kind of back to normal, right? It's a combination of competition in certain areas, cooperation in others, but with a focus on trying to understand that the U.S.-China relationship is not like the U.S.-Soviet relationship during the Cold War. It's a completely different, right? It's a completely different arena. But at the same time, acknowledging that China's rise is something that the international system is going to have to cope with. So in the end, this is how we got to the pivot to Asia, right? This is how I think we got to the pivot to Asia. I don't think we got there by, somebody, with a green eye shade sitting in the bowels of the White House saying, here's the plan, right? You know, part A, part B, part C, and we're going to implement each part of the plan. That's just not the way policy works, right? Instead is you have an idea coming in, you kind of know what you want to do, and then stuff happens, right? Then stuff happens, and it's all about trying to, you know, make lemonade out of lemons, right? Trying to do the best you can with what you have. And in that sense, you know, I think the way we arrived at the pivot probably took longer than I would have liked to see, but at the same time, I think, particularly if they can get TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, then this will be remembered as a very important turn in U.S. Foreign policy, based on both a maturing relationship with China and very continued strong, focused, and rejuvenated relationships with our traditional allies in Asia. So I think with that, thanks for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
I'm Jeff, and my question is, how do you think China's attempts to form kind of an alliance with South Korea the past few years has affected both the relationship with Japan and the U.S.'s kind of response?
Okay. So as David said, you know, I teach at Georgetown, but I'm also at CSIS, which is a think tank in Washington. And so, you know, what think tanks in Washington do is everybody meets and they talk about stuff like this, right? And so, you know, in Washington, everybody says, oh, South Korea, it's in play, right? 5 summits between Xi Jinping and Park Geun-hye, right? Clearly they like each other. Xi Jinping gets very nervous around Park Geun-hye, and I think he has a crush on her, you know? And no summits between Boy Wonder, right, and Xi Jinping, right, the North Korean leader and Xi Jinping, because nobody can find him, right? And so everybody thinks, oh, South Korea's in play. South Korea's in play. I just don't think that's right, right? And the other thing is everybody says it's because the South Koreans are pissed off with Japan. That's why they're drawing closer to China. Now, yes, it's true. South Korea does more trade with China today than it does with the United States and Japan combined. Okay, so that's very true. But I think the reason that the South Koreans are so interested in getting closer to the Chinese has nothing to do with Japan, absolutely nothing. It has everything to do with North Korea, right? Because for whatever reason, you know, and you know, there may be reasons that we don't know, the South Koreans sense that there's a little bit of space there, that the deep and unbending relationship between Beijing and Pyongyang is strained because they haven't met, right? The leaders haven't met. And you know, these days, every Chinese academic or official you talk to, they have no problem talking about how frustrated they are with North Korea, right? So I think that the reason that they're trying to get closer to the Chinese is they're trying to move the needle on North Korea, right? They're trying to get better understanding from the Chinese on the North Korean situation and, who knows, potentially unification, right? I think that's the reason they're so focused on doing this, not because they're pissed off with Japan. How does the United States feel about this? I think the United States likes it, right? I don't think the United States is worried that we're losing South Korea to China. I just don't think that's true. We're never going to lose South Korea to China. It's not going to happen. And if the South Koreans are getting a better understanding from China about how they feel about North Korea, that's to U.S. benefit too, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is what you hear out there, right, in the chattering classes, I don't think is the right interpretation of what's going on. I think it's actually a case where the South Koreans, going back to the last administration, Lee Myung-bak, have been trying systematically to try to make headway with China on North Korea, trying to work their way into getting the Chinese to calculate that their future on the Korean Peninsula is with the South Their past was with the North, but their future is with the South. And so I think that's what they keep trying to do with this. And the fact that they know the Chinese are pissed off with the North Koreans, this is their opportunity. I think that's why they're working so hard now.
My name is Sunghae, and I study public policy, emphasis in urban planning. And just going off of more of the unification issue, knowing that China is more working closely to South Korea now than before than North Korea, what would the role be for China during the unification process? Like, what role would China play in terms of North Korea and South Korea play with North Korea? Because I'm just wondering how much political power South Korea will have over North Korea, even though, say, they fall. If South Korea will be automatic unification, or China would have a big role, I'm assuming.
The best way to answer that question is to start with what we think are the key interests of each of the countries if unification were to happen. And so I think for China, the main interest, so if something like unification happens, it's very unstable, very scary, right? So for most countries, they think about what are the vulnerabilities that they face when the status quo gets disrupted. They don't think about necessarily how do I take advantage of this. Most countries think about what are the vulnerabilities, right? How do I protect myself? And so the main vulnerability for China is the border, right? Because if there's chaos inside of North Korea, the system's collapsing, you have a lot of refugees coming across the border, they don't want that for a variety of reasons, right? So I think their main concern would be the border, right? To try to regulate what's coming across that border, to try to stop a mass outflow of refugees. For the United States, I think one of the main concerns will be security, right? I mean, North Korea is not an insignificant nuclear weapon state. It's got a lot of ballistic missiles. It's probably got a lot of stuff we don't even know about today. And so if there's disorder in North Korea, I think the US is going to be very focused on how do we secure those weapons, right? So that there's not some crazy colonel in the corner somewhere who's saying, all right, this is it, right? You don't want that to happen, right? And then for the South Koreans, I think the primary thing that they'll be focused will be on domestic stabilization. They don't want chaos and disorder in North Korea. They don't want lots of North Korean refugees coming south. So they'll be focused on trying to create order and trying to create security to allow for this, to try to stabilize the transition process. Can events get out of hand in ways where the South Koreans would be left out? I know that this is always a fear that South Koreans have, but I don't think that can happen because I think everybody understands that if Korean unification happens, there's going to be help from the outside, right? There's going to be help from the United States, there's going to be help from China, there's going to even be help from places that South Korea doesn't want help from, like Japan, right? But at the same time, it's going to be the South Koreans that are in the lead. I don't think any country in the region is going to want to step on the toes of the South Koreans if unification happens, right? So that's my answer.
Hi, my name's Chad, and I'm a business major and a IR minor. I just had a question. With all the reports of espionage and cyber spying between the U.S. and China, do you see it as a continuing problem that will lead to more strained relations between China and the U.S.?
Sure, I think so. I think, so it's one of these issues it's a big issue in U.S.-China relations. At the last sets of these long bilateral meetings between Obama and Xi Jinping, this was singled out as one of the issues. But it's always singled out as an issue on which the United States and China should work together to try to deal with the problem. But the reality is it's not going to be that way, right? This is an area of competition. It's continued to be an area of competition. I think some hope that just like there are norms for how you conduct war, that maybe there are norms for how you conduct cyber war. I think that's what some people hope for. But this is going to be continuing to be an area of competition. The key, I think, is that in the U.S.-China relationship, this is not like the United States and the Soviet Union. It's just not. We can't contain China. It's not possible, right? The Soviet Union didn't own so much of our debt, right? That's like China does. You just can't. It just doesn't work that way. So what it is it's all about understanding that this is a big, complex relationship, and there are areas where the U.S. and China, in that relationship, there are areas where the U.S. and China can cooperate, and they try to cooperate, like North Korea, possibly Iran. But there are areas that are going to just be competitive, right? Missile defense is probably one of them. Cyber may be another. They're just going to be areas where there's competition. And I think the whole idea is that you don't want one of these areas to completely subsume all the other areas, right? Because it's not beneficial to either the United States or China, let alone the world. So.
Thank you. Chen Poli-Sci. Thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the content of the pivot. If you strip away the TPP, which is to date an unfinished product, what's left of the pivot to date, at least most prominently, really is the ramping up or revamping of the security alliances, the restationing of U.S. forces in the region, Australia, potentially in Philippines now as well. Is that enough to reassure allies without the trade component of it in this pivot? And can the administration actually look into the Chinese eyes with a straight face and say that this pivot is really not about containing them if it's only so reliant on the security components so far?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's a fair question. There was actually a report, a very good report that was done by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the so-called pivot to Asia, that it made exactly the same point, that essentially the pivot is, and the reason I say pivot, everybody else says rebalance because they don't like the term pivot, but I say pivot because President Obama says pivot. It's his policy, so that it's sort of unbalanced, that it is, the main things that we've seen is, this new rotation of Marines through Darwin, Australia, this new legal agreement with the Philippines, base restructuring in Korea and Japan, 60-40 balance of the Navy to the Asia theater, all these sorts of things. And it just looks like it's much more military than it is anything else. And then people think, oh, it's containment of China, right? A couple of things. The first is that, and I think that this is a fair criticism, is they never should have named it, right? When you come out and you say, we have a new policy, it's called a pivot to Asia, right? When you come out and do that and you sort of name it and you put a big label on it, it's going to create antibodies, right, immediately. And naturally, if it's everybody's talking about it, they're writing about it, right? You're doing videos about it at USC. I mean, when all this stuff is happening, then the Chinese notice, and they're like, oh, maybe this really is about us, right? Maybe it really is about us. And so, because they call it the pivot, China looks at TPP and they think, oh, that's economic containment of China, or economic exclusion of China. Right? We hosted Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor at Georgetown, where she gave a speech and she said very clearly, we want China to join TPP. Right? We just don't want the US and Japan, the second and third largest economies. We want the three largest economies in the world in TPP, right? Because that's the closest we're going to get to anything that resembles a global free trade regime, right? Because the global free trade regime negotiations are going nowhere. So this is the closest we can get. If we didn't name it the pivot, then maybe, China wouldn't feel so paranoid about it. So it is an issue. There should be other elements of the pivot too. We should not just be seeing military resources moving to Asia. We should be seeing cultural and economic resources moving to Asia, right? Whether it's expanded Fulbright programs, the 100,000 strong China initiative, we should be seeing more of that as well, and we're not, right? And then of course TPP. Now people go, well, it's just TPP and it's not done. But this is, I mean, it will be done. I think that before President Obama leaves office, it will be done. I mean, it doesn't look good right now, but I think it will be done. And then if that happens, people they're gonna be like, a rotation of Marines through Darwin? I mean, what's that? They're gonna focus on the Trans-Pacific Partnership being probably the most important new institution in Asia since the creation of the US alliance system, I think.
Gloria, majoring in international relations. With the rise of China, do you see a decline of the US influence or presence in Asia region?
So we did at CSIS, we did a survey of all the strategic elites in Asia to ask exactly this question. And essentially the answer that you get is that everybody acknowledges China's rise, right? Everybody acknowledges it. They acknowledge that their economic future is with China. And then you ask strategic elites, are they comfortable with that? Right? Nobody's comfortable with that, right? And then you ask them, you see your economic future with China, who do you see your strategic future with? China's down here, the United States is up here, right? So I think part of it is certainly hedging. I mean, I think hedging creates that sort of answer. They know that China's not going away, it's not moving anywhere. And so they feel like they need a hedge. So maybe it's not like they really love the United States, but they just want to make sure there's another big power hedging there. On the other hand, every study that I've seen that questions sort of American staying power and so-called soft power and all this, when you don't ask people in Washington, but you ask people in the region, surprising amount of support for U.S. leadership, right? Continued, very consistent support for U.S. leadership. Now, personally, I think that demand will always be there, even if U.S. capabilities are not there. I think there's a long lag time between who people see as leaders and their capabilities to continue to be that leader. So whether the United States wants to or does not want to be the leader in Asia, people are going to continue to look to the United States, right? Every time there's a crisis, right? Every time there's a crisis in Asia, right? Where do people look, right? They look to the United States. That's what they do, right? That's what leadership is about. You get criticized all the time when you're the leader, but when something happens, everybody wants you, right? Everybody wants you to help. And so I think that's sort of the role that they're going to play. And I think China's game is essentially, they don't want to go head-to-head with the United States. They want to continue to benefit from the system that the United States provides for, but at the same time slowly chip away at the legitimacy of the United States as the leader in Asia, right? Slowly chip away at that, talking about American lack of responsibility, hypocrisy, this sort of stuff. So, but I don't think it's as, and I think the region shows us it's not a zero-sum game, right? China rises, U.S. declines, right? It's not that easy. Right?
Thank you, Victor, for coming. Always fascinated by
Sure.
your talks. What are some scenarios that you see for reunification on the Korean Peninsula? I think, just from my own experience on both sides of the border up there, that there's a lot of, there's an assumption here that everybody in North Korea is chomping at the bit to get out. And I saw from being in Yongpyeong-do after the attack and all that the people in Seoul were so distanced from what was happening in Yongpyeong-do, that it was another world, that they don't relate to how things could really go wrong in a hurry. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on scenarios.
Well, I mean, I think there's sort of two standard scenarios. One is that there's a degree of reform that takes place in North Korea, that the economic gaps close, that over a very long period of time, you sort of move from two systems, two countries, to one system, two countries, essentially a confederal formula, otherwise known as a soft landing. Kim Dae-jung called that the soft landing. The other is otherwise known as the hard landing, which is it doesn't go gradually. It happens suddenly because the leadership collapses, because the economy collapses, because there's a major health crisis in North Korea. You know, it could be any one of these things or any combination of them that could lead to a collapse and a sudden unification scenario. You know, not unlike Germany, right? You know, USC and CSIS, we've been doing a project on this now for over 3 years, looking at all of this sort of stuff. My own view is between the sort of the sort of gradual and the sudden, it's not going to be gradual. I don't think it's going to be gradual. Yeah. I mean, in part, it's because of what we see today, right? We don't know where this guy is, right? He's been missing for over 5 weeks now. David's really worried. Like, he's very concerned. He's very concerned about where the leader is. You know, the economy's in shambles. The health system is broken. Everything's broken, right? So that's certainly one reason why it could happen suddenly. The other reason I think it could happen suddenly is the history of the Korean Peninsula, right? Nothing happens on the Korean Peninsula gradually. Everything happens suddenly, right? Whether it is occupation by a foreign power, the end of that occupation, division of the country by foreign powers, war, democratization, everything happens suddenly in this, you know, on this peninsula. And so I think there's something to that, you know, about the history of the peninsula. And so I think it's going to happen suddenly. And I think when it does happen, everybody out there is going to say, this is an impossible task. You know, Korea as a country is doomed. And I think that Koreans are going to show that they're wrong, right? And that is also in history, right? In history, I mean, David knows I'm writing a book now on looking at sort of how Kennan and John Foster Dulles and Eisenhower and Truman thought about the alliances in Asia at the end of the Second World War. And if you read Kennan on Korea, zero, right? Zero. I mean, I think I clipped a couple of quotes to save them because this great thinker, Mr. X, the doctrine of containment, was so 200% wrong on Korea, it wasn't even funny, right? And so I think that that's what will happen. The odds will be against them, and everybody will say, there's no future here. And, you know, just like they did at the end of the Korean War, they're going to prove everybody wrong. I mean, with help. I mean, the United States will help, I think, quite a lot, as will others. But I think it'll happen suddenly, and David will have a lot to write about. So.
Join me in thanking our speakers. Great job.